The wind blew us apart so fast that I think she tried to swim back to the sailboat, back to our sailboat, which was probably, I don't know, 1,000 yards or something. But the waves were 3 foot, and I was trying to ship the oars, and one of the pins on the oars broke, and that dropped over the side. And I was yelling for her the whole time, and I yelled to her that I lost an oar, and I threw the anchor out and anchored the dinghy, and I yelled. I threw her a flotation cushion that we used to sit on the dinghy, right after she went in. But I couldn't tell if she got it or not. So after an hour of calling her, I never heard her voice. And a powerboat came by, and I waved my flashlight on my phone, and they were so fast they didn't even see it. And then another one came by right behind it, sort of 5 minutes behind it, and I had grabbed the flares by then. I had 2 flares, and they didn't see the flares, I guess.
In January of 2024, Lynette Hooker sent a message to her friend Brian Stevenson. She and Brian had been sailing together for months. They had sold their home in Michigan, sold most of what they owned, and committed entirely to a life on the water. The Soulmate was not a vacation, it was their home. And somewhere on that boat, in the weeks before she sent that message, something had gone seriously wrong. She wrote, "I guess it was too much closeness. We decided to call it quits. I'm not going back." And then, "We were married 21 years. Our marriage lasted 6 weeks cruising." And then the sentence that has been sitting in the public record of this case since CBS News obtained those messages and that nobody has spent enough time with. "It was real bad. I can't be out there with him. I can't be out there with him." On a boat, in the Bahamas, with a man she had been married to for 21 years. It was real bad, and she could not be out there with him. She left. She went to her mother's home in Florida. She stayed there for a month, and then in late February 2024, she went back. Marnie messaged her on social media. "Looks like things are on the up and up." Lynette replied with heart emojis and a thumbs up. 14 months later, on the night of April 4th, 2026, she was gone. This is Forensic Disconnect. And today, we are going to go through everything that the people who knew Lynette and Brian Hooker are now saying publicly. The texts that resurfaced, the threats that Lynette's daughter disclosed on camera, the behavior of the man who called himself the husband of a missing person and spent 24 hours sitting on the boat they named Soulmate while she was somewhere in the Bahamas water, and hold all of it against the account that Brian Hooker gave police on the morning of April 5th. Because the friends are suspicious. The daughter is suspicious. The bartender who served them their last drinks says the timeline doesn't add up. And the Coast Guard has the boat. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This case deserves the same attention as every other major missing persons investigation this year. Subscribe. Let me start with Carly Hooker, because she is Brian's daughter from a previous relationship, not Lynette's biological daughter, and what she told Brian Entin this week is being reported as the daughter saying Brian made threats. That specific detail, that it is Carly, Brian's own daughter, saying this about him, is more significant than the headline framing suggests. Carly Hooker told Entin that she had been aware of threats made by her father 2 years ago towards Lynette involving the exact way she disappeared. The exact way she disappeared. Not a general history of violence. Specific threats about a specific act that matches the specific circumstances of April 4th, 2026. Brian Hooker allegedly threatened to throw Lynette overboard. She said, "The fact that this is happening now is kind of coincidental." Kind of coincidental. From his own daughter. Then she said something that has been underreported in almost every outlet covering this case. She recounted an incident years earlier when her mother told her Brian Hooker had choked Lynette and threatened to kill her and throw her overboard. "He's threatened it," she told News Nation. "I'm pretty sure. Multiple times." Multiple times. Not one incident. A pattern. A recurring threat about a specific act. Throw her overboard. And then, On the night of April 4th, 2026, Lynette Hooker went overboard from an 8-foot dinghy in the Bahamas. Brian Hooker's attorneys have denied all of these allegations. He has categorically and unequivocally denied any wrongdoing. He says his wife fell. He says the currents carried her away. He says he tried to get to her and could not. But the threats are documented, multiple times, from his own daughter. About the specific act that Brian says was an accident, now let's talk about the 2024 texts. Because the messages that Lynette sent to Marnie Stevenson in January and February of 2024 are the most specific pre-disappearance documentation of the state of the Hooker marriage that has entered the public record. And they deserve more analytical attention than they have received. Lynette left Brian in January 2024. She did not gradually drift away. She left. She went to her mother's home in Florida. She told Marnie it was real bad and that she couldn't be on that boat with him. She had quit her career, sold her house, and given away everything she owned to go cruising. And 6 weeks into the cruising life, something happened that was bad enough to make her walk away from all of it. She did not describe what happened in the messages. She did not name a specific incident. She said it was real bad. She said she was not going back. She said the marriage that had lasted 21 years had lasted 6 weeks cruising. 6 weeks on a boat, and the marriage was over. Whatever happened in those 6 weeks was sufficient to end what 21 years of a land-based marriage had not ended. The specific dynamics of a sailing life, the confinement, the isolation, the complete dependence on each other, the specific power imbalances that come from one person, typically knowing more about the boat and its operation than the other, can amplify conflicts that are manageable in ordinary domestic life to a degree that makes them unbearable. But Lynette did not describe dynamics. She described something that was real bad, something she could not go back out there with him for. And then, a month later, she went back. Why did she go back? The messages do not say directly. Marnie's observation that things were on the up and up got heart emojis and a thumbs up. Whether Lynette went back because she believed the specific behavior that drove her away had changed because she did not want to give up the life they had built together on the water. Because the specific financial and practical circumstances of having sold everything made returning to land more complicated than going back to the boat. The messages do not answer that question. What they document is the sequence, the departure, the "it was real bad," the "I can't stay on the Soulmate with him," and then the return, and then, 14 months later, the disappearance. Then there is Blaine Stevenson. Because Blaine Stevenson is Brian Hooker's friend, not Lynette's friend, not Carly's friend, not a hostile witness. Brian's friend. And what Brian's friend told Fox News Digital about the 24 hours following Lynette's disappearance is some of the most damning account of Brian's behavior in the public record. Stevenson said that after spending about 3 to 4 hours searching with rescue officials on April 5th, the day after Lynette went into the water, the day Brian reported her missing, Brian returned to the Soulmate and stayed there for roughly 24 hours. 24 hours. On the boat. The boat he says he never reached on the night she disappeared. The boat where Lynette's Apple Watch was found. The boat named Soulmate that is now in Coast Guard custody at Fort Pierce, Florida. Brian's friend said, at no point did he really look at the situation and give anybody any more details than he had at the beginning, when supposedly he was in shock. That qualifier, supposedly from Brian Hooker's own friend, about his own friend's account of his state after his wife disappeared, is the specific word that tells you what Blaine Stevenson actually thought about what he was seeing. Not when he was in shock. When supposedly he was in shock. A man whose wife just went into the Bahamian water in an 8-foot dinghy, who says he tried to reach her and could not, who says the currents carried her away while he watched. That man, if the account is true, would not spend 24 hours sitting on the boat they named after the concept of a perfect match. That man would be frantic, would be calling everyone, would be demanding that the search continue, would be in the water himself if he could physically manage it. Brian Hooker spent 24 hours on the Soulmate. His own friend noticed that his account of events never changed, never elaborated, never produced the kind of emotional processing that a man who watched his wife drown would produce over 24 hours of sitting alone on the boat where they lived, when supposedly he was in shock. Now let me go through the specific elements of Brian Hooker's account that have produced this level of suspicion. Not just from Carly and Carly, not just from strangers on social media, but from the people who actually knew Brian and Lynette. The friends, the fellow sailors. The bartender who served them their last drinks. The timeline. Brian told police he and Lynette left the Abaco Inn at approximately 7:30 in the evening on April 4th. Footage from the Abaco Inn shows them leaving at 6:40 p.m. That is a 50-minute discrepancy between Brian's account and what the camera captured. The significance of that discrepancy is specific. At 6:40 p.m. in early April in the Bahamas, it is still daylight. At 7:30 p.m., the light is fading toward dusk. Brian's account of the conditions, rough seas, deteriorating weather, darkness that made it impossible to see Lynette in the water, is more consistent with a 7:30 departure than a 6:40 departure. If they left at 6:40, there was still light when whatever happened happened. And if there was still light, the conditions Brian described are harder to reconcile with the timeline. The kill switch. Brian told police that Lynette was wearing the engine's safety lanyard, the kill switch, when she fell overboard. The kill switch is designed to be worn by the operator of the boat. Brian was the operator. Brian drove the dinghy. If the kill switch was on Lynette, as a passenger, and Lynette fell, the engine would cut out. That is the element of Brian's account that explains why he lost power and could not immediately return to where she went in. But Carly has said that Lynette would not normally have been wearing the kill switch, that it was Brian's device because Brian was the driver. If Carly is right, if the kill switch was normally on Brian, then Lynette falling would not have cut the engine. Brian would have had power. He could have turned the boat around. He could have gone back for her, the 8.5 hours. Brian left the Abaco Inn between 6:40 and 7:30 p.m. He arrived at a marina in Marsh Harbor at approximately 4 in the morning. The distance from Hopetown to Marsh Harbor is approximately 4 miles. The bartender who served them, a man named Ken who knows these waters, said it plainly. It's only 4 miles that way. It shouldn't have taken 8 to 10 hours to get there. 4 miles, 8.5 hours. With no engine, if the kill switch story is accurate, in 25-mile-per-hour winds. Maritime forensics experts can calculate what an 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy does in those conditions over that time frame, whether the drift alone accounts for both the direction and the duration. Whether Brian's account of paddling to Marsh Harbor is physically consistent with the conditions described, the direction of travel. If Brian was trying to get to the Soulmate, anchored at Elbow Cay near Hopetown, and the engine cut out, the direction he would need to travel is not toward Marsh Harbor. Marsh Harbor is on Great Abaco Island, across the Sea of Abaco, in a direction that is broadly away from the Soulmate's anchorage. Brian's arrival at Marsh Harbor is not the arrival of a man who was trying to get to the boat and was carried off course. It is the arrival of a man who traveled in a direction away from where his wife went into the water and away from the boat they were trying to reach. The Apple Watch. Lynette was wearing her Apple Watch at the Abaco Inn on the evening of April 4th. A photograph taken that night shows it on her wrist. According to Brian's account, she went into the water with everything she was wearing. The watch should have gone into the water with her. The Apple Watch was found on the Soulmate, the boat that Brian says he never reached that night, the boat that he was not on during the 8.5 hours, the boat where his wife's watch ended up. There is no innocent explanation for how Lynette's Apple Watch traveled from her wrist at the Abaco Inn to the deck of a boat that Brian says he never boarded. Either she was on the Soulmate at some point that night, which contradicts his account, or someone who had access to both Lynette and the Soulmate removed the watch and placed it there. The phone call. Brian called Carly to tell her that her mother was missing approximately 24 hours after Lynette went into the water. Not from the marina when he arrived at 4 a.m., not in the immediate aftermath, the following evening. And when he delivered the news, Carly described his tone as monotone and relaxed. Hey, your mom is missing. She's been missing since last night. We're going to come up there soon to see you. Monotone. Relaxed. 24 hours later. From a man whose wife of 25 years was somewhere in the Bahamian water. Ken, the bartender. The man who served them their last drinks at the Abaco Inn. A man who knows these waters and who heard Brian's account after the fact. He said, "It's only 4 miles. It shouldn't have taken 8 to 10 hours to get there." What catches my eye is they left here at 7:30, and this supposedly happened right after they left, and he didn't make it over there until 4 a.m. in 25-mile-per-hour winds. This supposedly happened. That word, supposedly, from the bartender who served them. The same word Blaine Stevenson used, when supposedly he was in shock. Multiple people who have no particular reason to be suspicious of Brian Hooker, his own friend, the bartender who served them, are using the same qualifier. Supposedly. There is a question nobody is asking loudly enough. Where is the search? Because one of the most disturbing dimensions of this case is the specific absence of any organized search for Lynette Hooker beyond the initial Bahamian Coast Guard efforts in the first days after she disappeared. Carly Aylesworth has raised this publicly. Where is the search? Where is the sustained, organized, funded effort to find her mother? The Nancy Guthrie case has produced 30,000 tips, a $1 million reward, FBI involvement, national media attention, and ongoing forensic analysis that has been running for more than 100 days. Lynette Hooker has been missing for 50 days, and the organized search effort is essentially non-existent. This is partly a jurisdictional reality. The disappearance happened in Bahamian waters. The Coast Guard has opened a criminal investigation, which means they are treating it as a crime scene rather than a rescue operation. A criminal investigation is not a search operation. It is an evidence-gathering operation. The Coast Guard seized the boat. They are processing it. They are conducting interviews. They are building a case. But Lynette is still out there somewhere, in the water, on a shoreline, in some location that the criminal investigation has not yet reached. And the specific person who would typically lead the effort to find her, the husband, who in cases like this either becomes the most committed searcher or becomes the primary suspect, is back in Michigan, citing his mother's illness, reportedly not searching. Brian Hooker's attorneys say he is desperate for answers, that he wants his wife found, that he cooperated fully with the Bahamian authorities, that he denies all wrongdoing. His own friend says he spent 24 hours on the Soulmate without elaborating on what happened, without producing the emotional processing that the situation would seem to require. The documented history of this relationship is not a sidebar. It is the context through which everything else must be read, because the pattern of incidents that preceded April 4th is the specific context through which every element of Brian's account must be evaluated. In 2015, there was a domestic incident in Kentwood, Michigan. Both Brian and Lynette were involved. Lynette told police she had been struck in the forehead by her husband. Brian told police he had been assaulted by Lynette, who struck him multiple times. The officer's report documented that Brian had a swollen, bloody nose. No visible injuries on Lynette were documented at the time. A prosecutor reviewed the case and found insufficient evidence as to who started the assault and dismissed it without charges. In January 2024, Lynette told Marnie Stevenson it was real bad and she couldn't return to the water with him. In January 2026, 3 months before she disappeared, Lynette told Carly Aylesworth that Brian had threatened to throw her off the boat during a fight in 2024. The specific threat. The specific act. The specific method that Brian now says was an accident. Carly Hooker told News Nation that Brian had choked Lynette and threatened to kill her and throw her overboard. Multiple times. He's threatened it, I'm pretty sure. Multiple times. The pattern is documented. The 2015 incident. The 2024 messages. The 2024 threat that Carly reported. Carly's account of choking and multiple threats about throwing overboard. And then April 4th, 2026, the night that Brian says the specific act he had allegedly threatened multiple times happened accidentally. Brian Hooker has denied all of this. His attorneys have denied it. He has not been charged with any crime. The investigation is active. The Coast Guard has the boat. The Soulmate is in federal custody at Fort Pierce, Florida. That matters more than the headline suggests. For the investigation. Because Carly Hooker said something specific when she found out the boat had been taken that tells you something about what the people closest to this situation believe is on it. She said, "I didn't even know they were going to take the boat when it got into U.S. waters. I was hoping that was going to happen, but I wasn't sure. Hoping. She was hoping the Coast Guard would seize the Soulmate. Not dreading it. Not worried about what it would mean for her father. Hoping it would happen. Because whatever is on that boat, whatever the forensic examination of the surfaces, the compartments, the specific areas that might contain biological evidence of what happened on or near the Soulmate on the night of April 4th, Carly believes it tells a story. The Apple Watch tells a story. The watch was on Lynette's wrist at the Abaco Inn. The watch was on the Soulmate. The Soulmate is now in Coast Guard custody at Fort Pierce. The specific evidence of how that watch traveled from Lynette's wrist to the deck of a boat that Brian says he never reached is somewhere in the forensic record of that vessel. The Coast Guard Investigative Service has experience processing maritime crime scenes. They know how to examine a boat, how to look for biological evidence on surfaces that have been exposed to the marine environment, how to recover the digital records from navigation equipment, how to reconstruct the timeline of a vessel's movements from the data it recorded. Whatever happened on or near the Soulmate on the night of April 4th, and whatever has happened on that boat in the weeks since, is in the evidence record that CGIS is now building. Brian Hooker's attorneys say he has been cooperating. The boat is in federal custody. The investigation is active, and the friends are suspicious. Ken, the bartender. Blaine Stevenson. Marnie Stevenson. The fellow sailors and the people who have followed the sailing community's social media documentation of Lynette and Brian's life. All of them questioning the same things. The timeline, the Apple Watch, the 8.5 hours, the 24 hours on the Soulmate, the monotone phone call. Lynette Hooker is 55 years old. She is from Lenawee County in Michigan. She built a life at sea with a man she had been married to for 25 years. She documented everything. The sea turtles, the manatees, the sunsets, the scuba tanks, the narrow channels. She called the ocean her happy place. She told her friend it was real bad. She said she couldn't be there. She went back. The boat is at Fort Pierce. The investigation is active. The friends are suspicious. The suspicion is not coming from strangers. And somewhere in the Bahamian water, or on a shoreline, or in some location that has not yet been searched, Lynette Hooker is waiting to be found. The FBI's research on intimate partner homicide, conducted through the Behavioral Analysis Unit and through the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, identifies specific risk factors that, when present in combination, substantially increase the probability of lethal violence in a relationship. The combination of factors present in the documented record of the Hooker marriage is not one or two isolated indicators. It is multiple risk factors operating simultaneously. Prior physical violence. The 2015 incident in Kentwood, Michigan, produced a police report documenting allegations from both parties. Regardless of who initiated the assault, which the prosecutor found insufficient evidence to determine, the incident documents the presence of physical violence in the relationship. Relationships that have produced one documented physical violence incident have significantly higher rates of subsequent violence than relationships with no documented incidents. Strangulation. Carly's account of Brian choking Lynette is the most significant single risk factor in the documented record of this relationship. The research on strangulation in intimate partner violence is specific and sobering. Non-fatal strangulation is one of the strongest predictors of subsequent lethal violence in intimate partner relationships. A 2008 study published in the Journal of Emergency Medicine found that women who had been strangled by an intimate partner were more than 6 times more likely to be murdered by that partner than women whose partners had used other forms of violence. The specific act of strangulation, which requires sustained physical control of the victim, which the perpetrator has described to researchers as feeling like total power over the victim, is not equivalent to other forms of physical violence in its predictive significance. Carly said Brian choked Lynette. She said it happened. She said he threatened to kill her and throw her overboard. If this account is accurate, the specific combination of strangulation and lethal threats against a specific method puts the documented history of this relationship in a category that forensic researchers would classify as high lethality risk. Threats connected to the eventual disappearance method. The specific threat to throw Lynette overboard is the act that Brian now says happened accidentally. The research on homicide and intimate partner relationships consistently finds that where threats are specific and method-specific, the probability that eventual violence will use the threatened method is significantly higher than chance. Perpetrators who threaten specific methods are planning in some form. They are rehearsing. They are establishing in their own mind a connection between the person and the method. If Brian Hooker threatened to throw Lynette overboard multiple times, as Carly described, and Lynette then disappeared from a boat in the Bahamas, the probability that the disappearance was the threatened act, rather than an accident that happened to match the specific threat, is a question that the statistical framework of intimate partner violence research would answer in a specific and uncomfortable direction. Isolation. The specific dynamics of the full-time sailing life that the Hookers had adopted by 2023 created a specific form of isolation that is itself a documented risk factor in intimate partner violence. Lynette had sold her house, quit her career, and given away most of what she owned. She did not have a separate financial base. She did not have a separate residence. She was, by 2024, dependent on Brian and the Soulmate in ways that a person living on land with their own home and career is not. The specific isolation of full-time sailing, at sea, away from family, away from the support networks that make intervention and exit possible, is a condition that forensic researchers have identified as amplifying existing violence patterns. The behavior that Lynette described as real bad in her 2024 messages may have been behavior that was always present, but had been manageable on land where she had more resources and exit options. On the boat, with everything sold and given away, the options were different. The 2024 departure was Lynette using one of the remaining exit options. She left. She went to her mother. She said she was not going back, and then she went back. The reconciliation after a violent or threatening incident is itself a documented pattern in intimate partner violence research. The reasons people return to relationships where violence has occurred are complex and documented: economic dependence, emotional attachment, hope that the behavior will change, the specific social and logistical complications of leaving a relationship in which both parties have fully integrated their lives. Lynette had sold everything. Going back to the Soulmate was not simple going back to what she had known. It was going back to the only life she had available to her in the immediate term. She sent heart emojis and a thumbs up. Whatever the specific reasoning, she returned, and 14 months later, she was gone. The mystery sailboat is a thread the investigation has not yet closed, because the Coast Guard's request for help identifying the vessel that was anchored near the Soulmate on the night of April 4th is the most specific ongoing investigative request in this case, and the fact that it has not been answered publicly is itself significant. The Coast Guard released a photograph of the mystery sailboat, a sailing vessel that was anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Cay on the night of April 4th, 2026. The same anchorage where the Soulmate was moored, the same night that Lynette Hooker disappeared. The Coast Guard's statement was specific. The owners and occupants of the sailing vessel may have information relevant to the CGIS investigation. May have information. That is the language of witnesses, not suspects. People who were there, who may have seen or heard something, who may be able to place the specific sequence of events that Brian describes, or contradict it, through their own account of what they observed from a vessel anchored nearby. An 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy in 25-mile-per-hour winds makes noise. 2 people in a dinghy on the water at night are audible to other boats in proximity. Whatever happened between the Abaco Inn and wherever Brian ended up at 4 a.m., whatever happened in those 8.5 hours, the people on the mystery sailboat were in the vicinity for part of that sequence. They have not come forward publicly. The Coast Guard has not publicly confirmed that they have been identified. The vessel remains unknown in the public record of this case. And every day that passes without the mystery sailboat's occupants providing an account of what they observed from Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th is a day that the most direct potential witness account in this case remains unavailable. If you were on a sailboat anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Cay in the Bahamas on the night of April 4th, 2026, contact the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service. The number is on the CGIS TIP app. You may have seen something that you do not realize is significant. The investigators believe you may have information that is relevant to finding out what happened to Lynette Hooker. Now let me talk about the comparison that Breitbart drew this week between the Lynette Hooker case and the disappearance of Natalee Holloway in 2005, because the specific parallel is worth examining. not because the cases are identical, but because the structural similarities reveal something about why this case has captured so much public attention. Natalee Holloway was 18 years old when she disappeared in Aruba in May 2005 during a high school graduation trip. She was last seen leaving a bar with Joran van der Sloot and 2 other men. She was never found. Van der Sloot was never convicted in connection with her disappearance. He was later convicted of murdering another woman in Peru in 2010 and eventually pleaded guilty to extorting money from Natalee's family. He is now serving a sentence in Peru. The Holloway case generated international attention for years. It became the defining missing persons case of the mid-2000s, a case in which the last person to see the victim alive was the primary suspect, in which the evidence was circumstantial, in which the local law enforcement investigation was contested, and in which the victim's body was never found. The Hooker case has the same structural features: an American woman disappearing in an international location, a husband who was the last person with her and who gave an account that people closest to the situation describe as not adding up. A local investigation that arrested and released the primary person of interest without charges. A victim whose body has not been found. A case that is now in the hands of U.S. federal investigators through the Coast Guard criminal investigation. The Holloway case was never resolved in the way that the family needed. Van der Sloot's conviction in Peru produced a kind of accountability. He confessed to her murder as part of the plea agreement. But the specific justice of a trial in which the evidence of what happened to Natalee was presented publicly never arrived. The Hooker case is still in its early stages. The boat is in federal custody. The investigation is active. The interviews are ongoing. The Apple Watch data, if it was extracted before the watch was removed from the Soulmate, is in the evidence record. Whatever the Soulmate's surfaces and navigation equipment and digital records show is being analyzed. Lynette Hooker deserves more than the Natalee Holloway outcome. Her family deserves more. Her daughter Carly, who went to the Bahamas and retraced her mother's last known steps and came home with the L necklace on her own wrist, deserves more. This doubt is not abstract. The daughter is asking questions. The Coast Guard has the boat. And the investigation is building toward whatever the evidence shows, toward the specific answer to what happened in those more than 8 hours between the Abaco Inn and the marina at Marsh Harbor. She told her friend it was real bad. She said she couldn't be on that boat with him. She went back. The boat is at Fort Pierce. The evidence is being processed. And somewhere in the water on a shoreline in the Soulmate's forensic record, the answer exists. Brian told police that he and Lynette left the Abaco Inn at approximately 7:30 p.m. on April 4th in an 8-foot hard-bottomed dinghy. They were heading to Elbow Cay to reach the Soulmate, which was anchored at Aunt Pat's Bay. The conditions, he said, had become rough. High winds, choppy seas, deteriorating weather. He said Lynette fell overboard. He said the kill switch, the engine safety lanyard that cuts power if the operator separates from the boat, was attached to Lynette rather than to him. When she fell, the engine cut out. He said he threw a flotation device toward her. He said he last saw her swimming toward shore. He said the currents carried her away. He said the dinghy, without power, began to drift. He paddled. He eventually arrived at a marina in Marsh Harbor at approximately 4 a.m. He did not call for help when Lynette went overboard. He did not use the radio. He did not signal other boats. He did not activate an emergency position beacon, which are standard equipment on vessels like the Soulmate. He did not anchor in the area where she went in and wait for her to surface. He paddled. For the full overnight window, 4 miles, to a marina in Marsh Harbor. Let's examine each element. The departure time. The Abaco Inn's footage shows them leaving at 6:40 p.m., not 7:30 p.m. Brian's account has the departure 50 minutes later than the camera shows. In the absence of an explanation for this discrepancy, it is either a genuine memory error, which is possible, especially if the subsequent events were traumatic, or it is a deliberate construction of a timeline that places the incident in darkness and rough conditions that are less consistent with a 6:40 departure, the kill switch. The kill switch is worn by the operator. Brian drove the dinghy, as a matter of established routine in the couple's documented sailing life. The kill switch being on Lynette as a passenger is the element of Brian's account that explains why the engine cut out when she fell. Without this specific detail, the loss of engine power that explains why Brian could not immediately return to where she went in is unexplained. The question of why the kill switch was on the passenger rather than the operator has not been publicly answered by Brian or his attorneys. The Apple Watch. Lynette was wearing her Apple Watch at the Abaco Inn. The watch ended up on the Soulmate. Brian says he never reached the Soulmate that night. The watch traveled from Lynette's wrist to the boat's deck through some mechanism that Brian's account does not explain. This is not a question that his account has left unaddressed by accident. It is a direct factual contradiction between what Brian says happened and where a physical piece of evidence was found. That stretch of time. 4 miles. With the specific weather conditions documented for the night of April 4th in the Sea of Abaco. Maritime forensics experts can calculate what an 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy does in those conditions without engine power. The direction of drift, the approximate speed, the likely endpoint of a drift from the area of the incident. Whether Brian's arrival at Marsh Harbor at 4 a.m. is consistent with the physics of the conditions has not been publicly analyzed and published. It is a calculable question with a calculable answer that should be part of the forensic record of this investigation. The direction of travel. Marsh Harbor is not toward the Soulmate's anchorage at Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Cay. It is across the Sea of Abaco on Great Abaco Island. If Brian was trying to get to the Soulmate and the current carried him, the question of whether the current from the incident location would carry an unpowered dinghy specifically to Marsh Harbor is the question that the maritime forensics calculation would answer. The 24 hours on the Soulmate. After the search and rescue effort on April 5th, Brian returned to the Soulmate and stayed there for roughly 24 hours. This is documented by his own friend, a man who says his wife is in the water, who says he last saw her swimming toward shore, who says the currents carried her away from him, spends 24 hours on the boat rather than continuing the search, calling family, or engaging in any of the behaviors that would characterize a person who believed their spouse was somewhere alive and findable. The phone call. 24 hours after Lynette went into the water, Brian called Carly, monotone and relaxed. "Hey, your mom is missing. She's been missing since last night." Carly was in shock at both the news and the tone. Each of these elements is individually explainable. People misremember times. Kill switch arrangements can change from normal routine. The Apple Watch could theoretically have been removed before the dinghy trip. Drift calculations can produce unexpected endpoints. People grieve differently. Phone calls to stepchildren can be awkward and tonally unusual, but the combination of all of them, the departure time discrepancy, the kill switch on the wrong person, the Apple Watch on the boat he never reached, those hours, the direction of travel, the 24 hours on the Soulmate, the monotone phone call, is a combination that produces the suspicion that his own friend expressed with a single word. Supposedly, Brian Hooker has not been charged. His attorneys deny all wrongdoing. The investigation is active. The Coast Guard has the boat. The investigation will answer the questions that the account has not answered. The Apple Watch data, if it exists, is in the evidence record. The Soulmate's surfaces are being analyzed. The mystery sailboat's occupants, if they are found, may have an account of what they observed from Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th. The forensic record of the boat that was named after the concept of a perfect match will be examined by people who know how to read it. And the friends who are suspicious, who have been watching this case develop for 50 days with the specific knowledge of people who knew both Brian and Lynette, will continue to be the most important public voice asking the questions that the account has not answered. Lynette Hooker told her friend it was real bad. She said she couldn't go back out there with him. She went back. The Coast Guard is looking. The investigation is building. And somewhere in the evidence record of the Soulmate, or in the account of the mystery sailboat that was anchored nearby, or in the specific calculation of what an 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy does in 25-mile-per-hour winds over that span, the answer to what happened to Lynette Hooker exists. She called it her happy place. The Scott Peterson case is the most frequently cited parallel in public discussion of intimate partner homicide cases involving bodies of water. Lacey Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve 2002. She was 8 months pregnant. Her husband Scott reported her missing and gave an account of his whereabouts, fishing at Berkeley Marina. Her body and the body of their unborn son were found in San Francisco Bay in April 2003, several months later. Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son. The conviction was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. No witnesses, no confession. No direct physical evidence placing Scott at the scene of the crime at the time it occurred. The prosecution built a case from the totality of the circumstantial evidence, Scott's behavior, his lies, his affair, the location where the bodies were found relative to where he claimed to have been fishing, and the jury found that totality sufficient to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. The Lynette Hooker case has circumstantial evidence of comparable specificity in several areas. The behavioral evidence of Brian's conduct, the 24 hours on the Soulmate, the monotone phone call, the account that his own friend describes with the word supposedly. The physical evidence inconsistency, the Apple Watch on the boat he says he never reached, the prior threats, the daughter's account of choking and throwing overboard, repeated multiple times, the timeline discrepancy, the 50-minute gap between the departure time Brian gave police and what the bar's camera shows. None of this is sufficient for a conviction. Scott Peterson's case required the bodies to be found. They were recovered 4 months after Lacey's disappearance, and the location where they washed ashore was consistent with the tidal and current patterns from Berkeley Marina, corroborating the prosecution's theory that Scott had disposed of Lacey's body near where he claimed to be fishing. The Lynette Hooker case does not yet have that corroboration because Lynette has not been found. But the investigation is building the record that will be evaluated against the threshold for charges. The Soulmate is in Coast Guard custody. The forensic examination will produce either evidence that corroborates Brian's account or evidence that contradicts it. The Apple Watch data, if it was extracted and if it records location or movement, may answer specific questions about where the watch was and when. The mystery sailboat's occupants, if they are found, may provide an independent account of what was happening in Aunt Pat's Bay that night. The George Smith case is another parallel worth examining briefly. George Smith of Ford disappeared from a cruise ship in the Mediterranean in 2005. His blood was found on an awning below his cabin. His wife Jennifer Hagel was the last person known to be with him. 4 other passengers were questioned. No one was ever charged. The case remains officially unsolved. The contrast between the Smith case and the Hooker case is instructive. In the Smith case, there was no suspect with a documented history of violence against the victim, no specific prior threats matching the method of disappearance, no physical evidence inconsistency as stark as an Apple Watch on a boat the suspect claims he never reached. The Hooker case has more specific circumstantial evidence than the Smith case ever produced publicly. Whether that evidence is sufficient for charges will be determined by the Coast Guard criminal investigation and federal prosecutors. The threshold for charges is not the threshold for certainty. It is the threshold for belief that a jury, presented with the evidence, could find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That threshold is being evaluated right now by the people who have seen the full evidence record, not the public record, but the complete investigative record of this case. Everyone who knew them is asking the same question. The daughters are suspicious. The bartender is suspicious. The investigators arrested Brian Hooker in the Bahamas, which required probable cause, specific, credible evidence sufficient to justify his detention as a suspect. They released him because they ran out of time under Bahamian law's 5-day detention limit, not because they concluded no crime occurred. The Bahamian police commissioner confirmed he remains a suspect in an active investigation. He is a suspect. The Soulmate is in federal custody. The investigation is building. The specific people speaking publicly about this case deserve attention. That has been speaking publicly about this case. Because the Hooker case is unusual in having multiple people from within Brian and Lynette's social circle, friends, fellow sailors, people who knew them both, going on the record with accounts that contradict or question Brian's version of events. Blaine Stevenson is Brian's friend. He told Fox News about the 24 hours on the Soulmate. He used the word supposedly. He is not Carly or Carly, who have obvious personal reasons to be suspicious of Brian. He is someone who knew Brian and chose to describe his behavior in the aftermath of Lynette's disappearance in terms that communicate skepticism. Marnie Stevenson, who shared the 2024 text messages with CBS News, was a friend of Lynette's through the sailing community. She had received the specific messages in which Lynette said it was real bad, and she couldn't stay on the Soulmate with him. She chose to make those messages public. The bartender Ken, who served them their last drinks at the Abaco Inn, gave multiple interviews to multiple outlets in which he described the timeline discrepancy and his specific knowledge of these waters and why the gap does not make sense to him. 3 different people, from 3 different social positions relative to Brian and Lynette, speaking publicly about specific aspects of the case that contradict or question Brian's account. Not strangers on social media who have been following the case. People who were there, who served them drinks, who received texts from Lynette, who spent time with Brian in the aftermath. Their accounts are not evidence in the legal sense. They are not witnesses to the crime itself, but they are the specific human record of a relationship and its aftermath that the investigation will incorporate into the fuller picture of what happened to Lynette Hooker. The friends are suspicious. The case is 50 days old. The Soulmate has been in federal custody for 2 weeks. The Coast Guard is conducting active interviews. The mystery sailboat has not been publicly identified. Carly Aylesworth has said she hopes to return to the Bahamas. Brian Hooker is back in Michigan. And the people who knew them, who sailed with them, who served them drinks, who received texts in the night saying it was real bad and I can't return to the water with him, are watching the investigation and asking the same questions that the investigation is asking. What happened in that duration? Where is Lynette? And how did her watch end up on the boat he says he never reached? If you have any information about Lynette Hooker's disappearance, contact the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service. If you were on the mystery sailboat anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay near Elbow Cay on the night of April 4th, 2026, please contact investigators immediately. You may have information that changes everything. Hit the like button, subscribe to Forensic Disconnect, drop a comment below. Lynette Hooker, 55 years old, from Michigan. She called the ocean her happy place. We will be back tomorrow.